The dirt on the boots of the men who had carried her husband's coffin was still dark with the damp of the grave when her brother-in-law walked toward her across the parlor. His voice pitched low enough to sound like family. "You need to be out of that house before sundown." Winifred said nothing, tightening her hand around her 6-year-old daughter pressed against her hip. By Wednesday, the walnut chest her husband had sanded and varnished across 3 Saturdays was carried out through the front door on the shoulders of a boy she did not know. By Saturday morning, she stood at the plank kitchen table with $43 a wool shawl and a folded square of paper bearing 7 words in her husband's tight handwriting. Mesquite Canyon, when all else fails. Her brother-in-law laughed from the porch as she turned toward the low ridges to the southeast, a small child's hand steady inside her own. Somewhere beyond the burning desert, her husband had been building something in silence for 4 years, and no one in that town yet understood what it was. The dirt on the boots of the men who had carried her husband's coffin was still dark with the damp of the grave. When Cornelius Ashcombe spoke the words that would strip Winifred Halloran Ashcombe of everything she had built in 7 years of marriage, he did not wait for the wake to end. He did not wait for the neighbors of Copper Hollow to finish their casseroles and their careful condolences and drift back to their own hearths. He walked to the corner of the parlor where she stood with her 6-year-old daughter Josephine pressed against her hip, and he spoke in a voice pitched just low enough to sound like family and just loud enough to be heard by the men who mattered. "You need to be out of that house before sundown, Winnie. It's how these things are done." She looked at him and understood in the way a woman who has spent her life reading fevers and weather and the small tightenings around a man's mouth understands the things men mean before they say them, that he had prepared this sentence during the burial. He had rehearsed it walking back from the cemetery with the rest of the pallbearers. He had chosen the word Winnie because it made him sound like a brother-in-law and not the man he was becoming in that moment. She said nothing. She tightened her hand around Josephine's small fingers and let him wait for a reply that never came. And eventually he moved away toward the coffee, and the wake continued around her as if the walls of her life had not just been quietly measured for demolition. She had gone to that parlor already carrying 3 things, and she left it carrying only those same 3 things, and a fourth she did not yet understand. The 3 were the brown wool shawl her mother Bridget had made her the winter she turned 15, the tin canteen Thaddeus had bought her the summer they moved to Mesquite Street, and the memory of her husband's voice from 3 nights before when the fever had broken just long enough to let him see her clearly one last time. The fourth was a small square of folded paper Cornelius had not yet noticed tucked deep in the pocket of her apron, where her fingers found it every few minutes without her deciding to check. 7 words written in the tight, cramped hand she had watched hunched over survey maps for a decade. Mesquite Canyon, when all else fails. Cornelius came for her at dawn the next morning with the practiced patience of a man who has decided to be reasonable in the moments before he stops being reasonable at all. He brought his wife Hester with him, apron already tied at her waist, as if she had walked the 12 blocks from her own home, ready to begin cooking in a kitchen she had not yet claimed. He brought his son Ambrose, 16 years old, tall as a man, with the square Ashcombe jaw and a habit of studying the corners of rooms as if calculating what they contained. Winifred opened the door before he could knock a second time. She had been awake since 3, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the folded paper flattened before her. Reading those 7 words, the way her mother had taught her to read scripture slowly without hurry, waiting for the meaning underneath the meaning to surface. Cornelius stepped inside the way a man steps into a room he already owns. He removed his hat. He nodded at the walls as if greeting them for the first time in their new capacity. "There's the practical matter of the house, Winnie. I don't want to rush you, but the practical matter doesn't wait." She watched Hester walk past her toward the kitchen without so much as a glance, watched her pause at the stove, and lay one flat hand on the iron top as if testing whether the fire was hers now. And she understood that the negotiation Cornelius intended to have with her was a formality intended to make the taking feel gentler than a taking. She poured him a cup of coffee because her mother had taught her that even the men who came to burn your barn deserved to be shown the manners of the house they were burning, and she asked him what he meant by the practical matter, and he told her. The house was in Thaddeus's name. The law of the territory of Arizona, in the year of our Lord, 1889, in matters of intestate succession, where no adult son survived the deceased, gave the property to the nearest male heir. He said the word law the way another man might say weather, as if it were a thing that happened to people and could not be argued with. She asked him what would happen to Josephine. He said Josephine could stay if Winifred agreed to reasonable terms. She asked him what reasonable meant. He said they could discuss it after she had time to think. By Wednesday, the walnut chest of drawers Thaddeus had sanded and varnished across 3 consecutive Saturdays in the spring of their 4th year was gone. She watched it leave through the front door on the shoulders of Ambrose and a hired boy from the livery stable, and she watched Cornelius negotiate its sale to a merchant on the plaza for $12, and she knew from the years she had spent buying goods at that same plaza that the chest was worth 40. She said nothing. She sat at the kitchen table where the walnut chest had stood for 4 years, and she felt the empty space behind her, the way a woman who has lost a tooth feels the empty space with her tongue, without wanting to, without being able to stop. On Thursday, Hester sold the dried herb bundles from the pantry to the apothecary on Franklin Street. Yarrow mullein, feverfew, valerian arnica. Winifred had gathered them across 3 seasons of walks into the hills east of Copper Hollow. Hester received $1.80 for the lot. On Friday, Winifred walked the 11 blocks to the office of Silas Ramsden, the only attorney in Copper Hollow, and she sat in the leather chair across from his desk, and she asked him whether the law truly said what Cornelius said it said. Ramsden was a decent man. He had known Thaddeus. He arranged the papers she had brought him with the slow, careful hands of a man who wished the arrangement would produce a different answer than the one he already knew. He told her the law said what Cornelius said it said. He told her that in the absence of a formal will, in the absence of any property registered in her name from before the marriage, in the absence of an adult son, she had the right to petition for support, and nothing more. He told her he was sorry. She thanked him. She walked home the 11 blocks with her hands folded in front of her apron, the way her mother had walked home from a birth that had not gone well, back straight, eyes forward, thinking. On Saturday morning, Cornelius knocked twice on the door of the bedroom she had shared with Thaddeus for 7 years, and he opened the door before she could answer. "I need you out by sundown, Winnie. Ambrose will be taking this room." She was sitting on the edge of the bed with the folded paper in her hand. She looked at him, and she thought about the coffee she had poured him 4 days earlier. She thought about the man she had married. She thought about the difference between her husband and his brother, and she thought about the strange fact that 2 men could grow from the same table and become such different animals. She said, "Where am I supposed to go?" He said, "There's a boarding house on Camino Street, $2 a week, or your family in Prescott. That's your affair." She said, "I have $43. He said, "That's plenty for the boarding house, enough time to figure things out." Hester appeared in the doorway behind him with the same apron she had worn on Tuesday. She said in a voice that was trying to sound kind, "I can give you a blanket and some cornbread for the road." Winifred looked at her sister-in-law, and she looked at Cornelius, and she felt something settle at the base of her stomach with the physical certainty of a stone dropping into a well. And she knew from that certainty that she would not be going to the boarding house on Camino Street or to her family in Prescott. She would be going to Mesquite Canyon. She had been born in 1860 on a small ranch 6 miles south of Prescott, the 4th of 7 children of Amon Halloran, a blacksmith whose Irish parents had come across the Atlantic during the potato blight and made their slow westward migration until they had reached the last territory where a man could still hammer his own life out of the raw metal of the land. Her father had large hands and a stammer he had inherited from his own father, and he spoke rarely, but he laid those hands on the tops of his children's heads at breakfast every morning of her childhood, and she had understood without being told that this daily benediction was the way he said the words he could not say. Her mother, Bridget Halloran, was a midwife who could not read music but could read a fevered forehead with the accuracy of a physician, and Bridget had noticed when Winifred was 7 years old and already reading the family Bible aloud with more fluency than her older brothers, that her 4th child had been given a mind that was going to need to be fed. Bridget fed it with everything she had. She fed it with the Bible and with the letters that came twice a year from her brother in San Francisco, describing the ships in the bay and the fog that rolled through the streets at dawn. She fed it with an old McGuffey reader she had traded a season of poultices for, and with the arithmetic primer she borrowed from the school teacher 2 ranches over. She fed it with the herbs of the desert hills and the names for each of them in English, and in the older tongues her neighbor Alma had taught her during the long summers when the men were away with the survey crews. "A woman who can read is a woman no man can cheat with paper." Bridget told her daughter one afternoon when Winifred was 10, braiding her heavy black hair on the porch while a summer storm gathered over the mountains to the west. Winifred did not understand the sentence then, not fully, not in the way she would come to understand it later. She heard it the way a child hears a piece of weather as a fact about the world that would matter someday if she remembered it. She remembered it. She remembered it on the Friday afternoon in Silas Ramsden's office, when he told her the law said what Cornelius said it said, and she understood then, at the age of 29, sitting in a leather chair in a lawyer's office in Copper Hollow, with her hands folded in her lap, the full weight of what her mother had been telling her while the rain came down over the mountains 20 years before. She had grown up on that ranch until she was 17, learning to deliver a calf and stitch a wound and set a hair snare, and grind cornmeal on the stone mill her grandmother had brought west from Missouri, wrapped in an old army blanket. When her father's hand was crushed by a runaway forge hammer in the summer of her 14th year, and he could no longer swing iron the way he had for 25 years, the family did not fall apart the way families sometimes fell apart on the frontier when the man could no longer work. It bent. It reorganized itself around the smaller income that Bridget could bring in from her midwifery, and around the older brothers who took work at neighboring ranches, and around Winifred herself, who at 14 was already earning small amounts in barter for the poultices she prepared under her mother's supervision. She learned in that year the thing her mother had already known for a decade, that a household that is careful and clever and refuses to be ashamed can survive nearly any collapse if the people inside it agree not to turn on each other. She would carry that knowledge with her for the rest of her life. She would carry it into the Mesquite Canyon. She had met Thaddeus Ashcombe in October of 1877 when she was 17 and he was 22 on a rutted trail between two ranches on the far side of a low ridge that separated her family's land from the small mining settlements north of Prescott. He was sitting on a flat rock with a survey map unfolded across his knees and a pencil behind his ear, and his hat was pushed back on his head in the manner of a man who had been staring at the same problem long enough to forget where his hat was. She was walking home from a delivery that had gone easier than she had feared, and she was tired but not weary, and she was in the kind of mood where a young woman notices a young man on a rock and decides without quite deciding to speak first. "Your map's wrong. That arroyo doesn't run north. It bends northeast, and it goes dry by August." He looked up. He looked at the map. He looked back at her, and his eyes were the color of hazel shells, open fresh. And he did not say what most men would have said to a 17-year-old girl on a country trail. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because I've been walking this country for 12 years with my mother." She started walking again. He caught up before she reached the first mesquite. They talked for 2 hours on that flat rock in the shade of a Palo Verde tree, with the map between them and her finger, tracing corrections that the surveyor from Phoenix, a man who apparently never dismounted to check what he was drawing, had committed to paper either through laziness or through the arrogance that men in cities sometimes brought with them when they came out into country they did not know. Thaddeus listened. He listened the way she had never been listened to before, without interruption, without the small nervous male impulse to seize the reins of the conversation and turn it toward himself. He made notes in the margins of the map with a pencil that was small enough to disappear in his palm when he wasn't using it. Before the sun touched the ridge, he asked whether he might come back and walk the arroyos with her to verify her corrections in person. She said he could come with her mother and with her. Both of them. He said, of course. He said it not the way a man agrees to a condition, but the way a man understands why the condition exists and respects it completely. That more than the eyes or the pencil or the 2 hours of listening was the moment she began to consider him something other than another surveyor's assistant passing through. He came back the following Saturday and the Saturday after that, and by the fourth visit, her mother Bridget had invited him to supper and had studied him across the whole meal with the same attention she gave to the herbs of the hills, looking for what was not obvious at first glance. After Thaddeus had gone, Bridget washed the dishes in silence for a long while, and then without turning to look at her daughter, she said the sentence that Winifred would remember for the rest of her life. "That man thinks before he speaks. It is a difficult thing to find." 16 months later, they were married in the small stone church at Prescott, and Cornelius Ashcombe stood beside his younger brother at the altar with his wife Hester and their 2 small children, Ambrose and Millicent, and he embraced his brother with what Winifred understood even in the moment was a genuine affection. He then leaned to kiss her cheek in welcome, and his lips were cold. She noticed the coldness, the way she had learned to notice small things, without alarm, filing it away, in the same place she filed the movements of clouds and the changes of moon in case the information became useful later. It became useful. It would take her 10 years to understand how useful. The first years in Copper Hollow were the years of learning what a marriage was and what a household required. Thaddeus took a position as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office at $14 a month, a modest wage that placed them in the small ecosystem of Copper Hollow in the lower tier of respectability, above the day laborers and the drifters, but below the merchants and the ranchers and the two doctors. Winifred supplemented the wage with the same herbal work she had done alongside her mother riding out to the surrounding ranches when a woman was in labor or a child was burning up, accepting payment in coin when coin was available and in dried beans and cornmeal and jars of preserves when it was not. They rented 2 rooms in a courtyard on Mesquite Street, and she planted cilantro and thyme and rosemary the first week, because a garden was the first assertion a woman made that a rented house could still be made her own. Thaddeus was quiet in the house but restless in his mind. He spent evenings with maps spread across the kitchen table, not the official maps from the office, but his own, drawn by his own hand across long, careful hours, studying the geography of the territory with a dedication that exceeded anything his ordinary employment required. She brought him coffee and sat beside him and watched his finger move across contour lines and elevation marks, and sometimes he would explain what he was seeing. A rock formation that suggested underground water, a pattern of vegetation that indicated rich soil, a depression in the terrain that the government maps had marked as valueless, but that Thaddeus said the government maps were wrong about. The men who make these maps, he told her once tapping a printed contour, have never walked the ground. They look from far away and they draw what they wish to see. She listened. She learned. Without meaning to, she began to see the desert of the territory through his eyes, not as a hostile, empty place, but as a complicated living system that gave up its secrets only to those who asked with patience. They had waited a long time for a child. She had come to understand in the 3rd and 4th years of their marriage that the waiting itself was a kind of ache neither of them named. Thaddeus never asked her about it. He never made her feel the failure. He simply continued to bring her coffee in the mornings and to touch her hand in the small ways that meant, without words, that his love was not conditional on the arrival of a child. When Josephine finally came in the summer of 1883, on a July morning, when the whole valley smelled of creosote after a night of rain, she came strong. She came with a voice that filled every corner of the rented rooms on Mesquite Street and made Winifred laugh with a relief so pure it startled her. Thaddeus held the baby with a care that was almost excessive, as though the small weight in his arms were a responsibility he was taking with the full seriousness of the world. He spoke to Josephine from the first day, describing the maps to her, pointing out the moon through the window, telling her in a low voice as if it were a secret the names of the stars over northern Arizona. Rigel, Betelgeuse, Polaris, the 3 sisters of Orion's belt. The child listened. Whether she understood or not, the child listened. In the spring of 1885, Thaddeus was promoted to assistant clerk at $22 a month, and they bought the house on Mesquite Street from the previous owner for $180, gathered across 4 years of careful economy. Nights without lamp oil to save on the fuel. Meat only 3 days a week. The herbal work done in the light before dawn and after supper. Winifred kept the ledger. She counted the coins into the tin box under the bed every Sunday evening. When the sum was enough, they bought the house and the deed went into Thaddeus's name because the law required it and the custom required it, and it did not occur to her in 1885 that the deed being in his name would matter in the way it came to matter 4 years later. She was 25 and had a healthy child and a house of her own and a husband who thought before he spoke. She did not know to be afraid of the paperwork. That was the spring the Saturdays began. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, without alarm, at first only with the attention she paid to any small variation in the pattern of her days. Thaddeus would announce on Friday evening that he intended to ride out and inspect some parcels of terrain on his own account, something he had done occasionally since their marriage and which had never seemed remarkable. Then it happened again the next week and the next. His boots came back caked with the reddish clay that did not appear in the immediate surroundings of Copper Hollow. His trousers carried the fine white dust of lime. Once she found scrapes on the backs of his hands, as if he had been shifting stones. He did not explain, and she did not ask, because she had come to understand something about her husband in the years of their marriage that she could not quite put into words. His ideas needed silence to reach language. If you pressed him, the root closed. If you waited, the idea would flower on its own in its own season. So she waited. She noticed that he came back from those Saturdays not with the exhaustion of a man who had done something that weighed on him, but with the exhaustion of a man who had done something that filled him. He ate with real appetite. He slept deeply. He looked at Josephine as if the world made sense. One night in the second year of the Saturdays, lying awake in the deep silence of the desert, past midnight, she asked herself what her husband was doing. The first answer that came to her before the worries and the small feminine fears could rise was this: something good. Something he does not want to explain yet because it is not ready to be explained. With that answer, she went to sleep. She did not know then that she was right in a way she could not yet imagine. There was a Christmas Eve she would carry with her afterward as a kind of touchstone, the way one carries a smooth stone from a river in a pocket to remind oneself that the river existed. It was 1887. Thaddeus had come home from the market with a bottle of sweet wine that a merchant had brought up from California, an extravagance she pretended to scold him for and secretly loved. She had made the sugar and cinnamon fried donuts her mother used to make, the ones that filled the house with the smell of caramelized brown sugar and hot oil, and Josephine, 4 years old, had eaten 2 of them and fallen asleep on the rag rug beside the stove with sugar on her chin. When the child was in bed, Winifred and Thaddeus sat out on the small porch with the wine between them and the December sky over Copper Hollow, so full of stars it seemed to press downward. He looked up at that sky for a long time, and then without turning to her, he said, "You know what I love most about you, Winnie? It's that you never feared the country. From the first day I saw you, I knew. You belong to this land not by being born to it, but by understanding it." She took a slow sip of the wine. She looked at him. She said, "You aren't like the men who draw without walking." He reached for her hand. They sat that way until the cold pushed them inside. The typhoid came in August of 1889, brought into Copper Hollow by a contaminated cistern at the boarding house on Camino Street, and spread through half a dozen homes before the town council understood what was happening. She had seen typhoid before. She had watched her mother lose 2 patients to it in the summer of her 15th year, and she knew from the first day Thaddeus came home with the low fever and the headache and the pale expression that she was in a fight she might not win. She fought it with everything she had. Yarrow tea and mullein leaves and cool cloths changed every half hour through the long, hot nights. She slept in fragments. She did not eat properly. Josephine went to stay with Temperance Hollis, the 55-year-old widow who lived across the street and had loved Josephine since the day she was born, and who now took the child in without a single question. Winifred was grateful for the woman's silence more than for any of her practical help. Some kinds of love do not need to explain themselves. Thaddeus had moments of clarity. In one of them, on the Wednesday of the second week when the fever dropped just far enough for his eyes to return to their proper place. Behind his face, he took her hand and squeezed it hard enough that she almost pulled away out of surprise. "Mesquite Canyon. When all else fails, you have to remember." She thought at first it was the fever talking the way patients sometimes spoke sentences that sounded important, but came from the disorder in the head. She stroked his hand and told him to rest. He held on harder. "It's not delirium, Winnie. Listen to me. Mesquite Canyon. When all else fails, you will remember. I will remember." 3 days later, on the 1st of September, 1889, Thaddeus Ashcombe died. I was 34 years old. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time afterward, watching the shape of him under the blanket, understanding that the shape was already becoming something other than what it had been. Dr. Kingsley arrived from Tucson too late to do anything useful, but in time to sign the death certificate. He was a thin, distracted man with soft hands and a professional manner that did not manage quite to conceal his relief at not being the one whose bedside vigil had failed. He stayed less than 20 minutes. Cornelius arrived half an hour after the doctor left, before Winifred had done anything more than sit at the kitchen table and stare at the floor. He arrived with Hester and with Ambrose. He arrived with the familiarity of a man who knew he had the right to enter, who had always had that right, who had never needed anyone to give it to him. "We are so sorry, Winnie." He said it, and the sorrow in his voice was genuine. Cornelius did love his brother. That was the thing she would only later come to understand, that the love and the taking could live in the same body without contradiction. Hester embraced her. It was a real embrace, warm, and Winifred allowed herself to be held because in that moment, Hester was the closest thing available to hold on to. Ambrose stayed in the doorway with his hands in his pockets studying the furniture. The wake was in the house. That night the neighbors came, colleagues from the land office, some of the ranch women she had attended over the years. Temperance Hollis leading Josephine by the hand and remaining beside Winifred through the entire evening without saying much and without letting go of her fingers. Cornelius received the visitors in the parlor as though the house were already his. He offered whiskey he had brought himself. He accepted the condolences with the grave voice of the family man in charge of the situation. Winifred watched him do it and said nothing. She was too exhausted to say anything. She had slept 14 hours in the previous 3 weeks. Her body was a thing that functioned by habit rather than by will. The burial was the next morning at 10 in the cemetery at the edge of town. Josephine went with her. She would not leave the child with anyone. Reverend Wetherall, the old preacher with the thin voice who had known Thaddeus for years, said a few words about the goodness of the deceased, and the words seemed true to Winifred, and that helped a little. It was on the walk back from the cemetery to the house that Cornelius drew alongside her and began to speak of the practical matter. She sat on the edge of her bed that Saturday morning, after he told her Ambrose would be taking the room, and she looked at the mark on the wall where the mirror had hung until Hester had taken it down 2 days earlier, and she took the folded paper from beneath the pillow. She had been sleeping with it there since the night of the wake, when she had gone through the small wooden box on his side of the dresser, looking for the pocket watch to give to Josephine as a keepsake, and had found instead the paper folded 4 times with the 7 words in his handwriting. She had not understood it then. She had thought it was the fragment of a survey note or a reminder to himself about a parcel of terrain he had wanted to revisit. She had folded it back and placed it in her apron pocket and worn it for 6 days without thinking clearly about what it might mean. Now sitting on the bed with the Saturday sun coming through the window and Cornelius's footsteps audible in the next room, she read it again, and this time she read it not as a note, but as an instruction. And she remembered his fingers tightening on her hand 3 weeks earlier. "It's not delirium, Winnie. Listen to me. You will remember." Temperance Hollis crossed the street when she saw the door open. She had been watching from her own window since Cornelius had gone in that morning, and she came into the kitchen without knocking, because there are moments when even the manners of the frontier give way to the older obligations. She had brought a canvas satchel over her shoulder, and she set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Inside were 3 loaves of hard bread wrapped in cheesecloth, a small crock of lard, a strip of dried beef the length of a man's forearm, a wool blanket thick enough to sleep on, a second canteen larger than the tin one, and a folded scrap of paper on which she had drawn from memory the rough trail to the ranch of a goat herder named Barnaby Quill, who lived a day's ride to the southeast. "You can leave the child with me, Winnie, as long as you need. She would be safe here. I would love her like blood." Winifred put her hand on the older woman's shoulder. She said, "Thank you, but she comes with me, and I will keep her safe." Temperance nodded. She did not argue. She said, "Barnaby knew your husband. He will help you." Winifred did not ask how Temperance knew that. There would be time for that later. She counted her $43 twice and divided them among 3 pockets sewn into 3 separate garments, so that if she was robbed on the trail, she would not lose everything at once. She dressed Josephine in the sturdy pinafore and the leather shoes and the wide-brimmed straw hat that would keep the sun off the child's face across the miles ahead. She braided the child's hair tight against the wind. She rolled the wool blanket and tied it to the satchel. She filled both canteens at the pump in the courtyard, the tin one and the larger one Temperance had brought. When she came out of the bedroom for the last time with the satchel over her shoulder and Josephine's hand in hers, Cornelius was in the parlor examining something in a stack of papers. He looked up. He saw the satchel. He saw Josephine. He saw the direction she was taking, which was not toward the boarding house on Camino Street, and not toward the road south toward Prescott, but toward the low ridges to the southeast. "Where are you going?" She answered without stopping. "Mesquite Canyon." He laughed. It was a real laugh at first, the laugh of a man who has heard something absurd and cannot help himself. "That's Scorpion Gulch, Winnie. Don't be foolish. That was one of Thaddeus's ideas he never did anything with. Half of what your husband talked about at night was daydreams." She said nothing. She kept walking. She reached the gate. She heard him from the porch behind her, and the laugh was gone from his voice, now replaced by something sharper, more impatient. Be gone before sundown, Winnie. Do you hear me? Be gone before sundown. She did not turn. She did not answer. She took Josephine's hand more firmly and walked out of the house on Mesquite Street for the last time. They walked out of Copper Hollow with the morning still cool, the clean stretch of hour and a half between the dawn and the moment when the sun clears the eastern ridges and falls vertical across the country. She walked quickly at first, and Josephine kept up with a determination that would have made Bridget Halloran proud, small legs pumping against the rhythm of the trail, hands steady inside her mother's hand. After the first mile, the pace settled. Winifred had calculated from the maps Thaddeus had described to her across so many nights of coffee and lamplight that Mesquite Canyon lay something over 40 miles to the southeast. 2 days for a woman on foot at a moderate pace. She did not mean to walk the whole distance. Temperance had told her Barnaby Quill's ranch stood roughly half the way, and Temperance had also told her quietly on the porch, as she pressed the satchel into her hands, that Barnaby would be waiting. Winifred did not ask how she knew that either. There were many things she was going to learn in the coming weeks about how much her husband had prepared and how many people already knew what she was only beginning to understand. Josephine walked in silence through most of that first morning. She was a child of the kind of a temperament that does not spend words unnecessarily, the same temperament as her father. And when she spoke, it was because she had something concrete to say. A lizard crossing the trail, a blood-red flower on the stalk of an ocotillo, a hawk carving perfect circles above a rising column of warm air. Winifred gave her the names in a low voice, as if naming were a way of keeping the world in the world. Mommy, did Papa come to the canyon a lot? A lot, Josie. Yes, he did. Josephine thought about this across several steps. Why didn't he take us? Winifred did not have the answer yet. Yet I don't know yet. We are going to find out when we get there. That answer seemed to satisfy the child, who nodded and kept walking. They stopped at midday in the shade of a stand of mesquites growing around a shallow depression in the ground, where the darker soil showed that water had pooled there sometime during the rainy season. Winifred took out a portion of the dried beef and a piece of the hard bread and divided them more for the child than for herself. She let Josephine drink from the tin canteen first, and then took a small sip from the larger one. She had known deserts long enough to know that thirst was not the enemy on the first day. Thirst was the enemy on the third. What mattered on the first day was not thinking about the second. She thought about Thaddeus during that midday rest. She thought about him with an intensity that hurt physically, a pain located precisely behind her breastbone, in the place where physicians would put no name, but where any woman who has lost the man she loved knows that grief lives. She thought about his ink-stained fingers. She thought about the voice he used when he explained contour lines to her, softer and more passionate than his ordinary voice, as though speaking about the land made him briefly a more complete person. She thought about Mesquite Canyon, when all else fails. She asked herself, not for the first time, what he had known that she had not known. They walked on through the afternoon, and the country grew more difficult. The trail thinned. In one long stretch, it disappeared entirely into the general emptiness, and she had to navigate by the angle of the light and the direction in which the cactus stalks leaned according to the prevailing wind, the way her mother had taught her to read the ridgeline the summer she was 12. Toward the end of the afternoon, they found water in a rock basin, a natural stone hollow where rainwater collected and held for weeks in the shade of a gray granite face. Josephine drank, cupping the water in both palms without manners, the way the desert animals drank, and Winifred understood that this was exactly the correct way. They filled both canteens and moved on. That first night they slept beneath a stand of palo verdes on a slope that turned its back to the wind from the north. She spread the wool blanket on the ground and lay down with Josephine curled against her body, the way the child had always slept in the cold nights of Copper Hollow. The stars over the desert that night seemed more numerous than she remembered stars ever being. Or perhaps they had always been that way. And what had changed was that at this point in her life, there was no roof and no city concerns to distract her from looking up. Josephine slept quickly. Winifred took longer. She had a moment of pure fear in that first darkness. The old fear that is older than reason and cannot be argued with by reason. The fear of being alone in a place with no one who knew her, with no direction of return worth taking, with a small child, and $43 and a piece of paper on which 7 words had been written by a man who was now under the ground in the cemetery at Copper Hollow. The fear lasted for several minutes. She let it stay. She breathed through it. At some point, she could not identify precisely the fear past. What remained was not courage exactly. It was something simpler. It was the determination that does not come from the head, but from the body, from the place where survival lives. She closed her eyes. She slept. And somewhere between the Palo Verde branches and the wide sky above them, she felt for the first time since her husband had died, the small, quiet beginning of an idea she could not yet name. That she was not walking away from something. She was walking towards something. And the man who had died in her arms 3 weeks earlier had known all along that this day would come. The dawn of the second day came without ceremony over the Palo Verde branches, a slow lightening at the eastern horizon that woke Winifred before it woke the child. She lay still for a few minutes with Josephine's small breath against her collarbone and used those minutes to count what she had physically in her possession and what she had less tangibly in the store of everything her mother had ever taught her. The larger canteen was still 3/4 full. The tin one was half. The dried beef would last another day and a half if she was disciplined. The hard bread would go faster than the beef because the child preferred it. She had the wool blanket, the shawl, the paper of 7 words, and $43 distributed across 3 pockets. What her mother had taught her would have to be counted differently. It was not something you could measure, only something you could trust yourself to remember when the moment required it. She woke Josephine gently and gave her a piece of the bread and a swallow from the tin canteen. The child ate without complaint. There was a seriousness to her that morning that Winifred had not seen before. Not the seriousness of fear, but the seriousness of a small person adjusting to the fact that the rules of her life had changed and the adjustment was going to require her attention. They rolled the blanket. They set out. The country of the second day was harder than the country of the first. The trail had climbed steadily during the previous afternoon without her noticing it, and now they were descending into a series of low, rocky ridges where the granite pushed through the surface in outcrops the color of dusty rose. Thaddeus had told her once on a Sunday walk in their second year of marriage that the darker basalt intrusions in this part of the territory meant the region had been a field of fire in some ancient time before any human being had walked it. She had thought at the time it was the kind of poetic thing men said to impress women. She understood now that it had been literal. Underfoot everywhere in this stretch of desert were the cooled remains of an old violence patient beneath the surface waiting. They found the goat herder's ranch a little past mid-morning. 3 small adobe rooms arranged around a swept dirt yard, a stone corral behind a lean-to of cottonwood poles that served as shade for the animals during the worst of the summer heat. A thin line of blue smoke rose from a stovepipe. Before she could call out, an old man stepped from the doorway of the largest room and stood watching her come. He was 70 at least, thin as a piece of tanned rope with white hair cut short and hands that hung loose at his sides in the manner of a man who had spent a long life waiting for animals to do what animals were going to do. Barnaby Quill lifted his chin in greeting without speaking. She raised her free hand. She came forward the last 100 yards with Josephine's grip tightening a little against her palm. He did not ask her name at first. He looked at her, and he looked at the child, and he looked at the canvas satchel over her shoulder, and something in his face reorganized itself. He said, "Coming out of the sun." He said it not as an invitation but as an instruction, the way a man who has lived alone a long time speaks to living creatures when they arrive at his door. She followed him into the largest of the 3 rooms, which was cool with the specific coolness that thick adobe walls produce even in the hottest hours, and she watched him ladle a stew of beans and green chili from a heavy pot on the stove into 2 tin bowls without asking whether she was hungry. He set the bowls on a rough plank table. He set a plate of fresh cornbread beside them. He nodded at the chair. Josephine climbed onto the chair and began to eat with a hunger that shamed Winifred to see, because it revealed that the rationing of the last day and a half had been felt more than the child had let on. Winifred ate too, and slowly, so that the child would slow her own eating. The old man stood at the stove watching them without pretending not to. He said when they were most of the way through the bowls, "Ashcombe." Her spoon paused. "Yes." He nodded once as if a small thing he had suspected had been confirmed. "That boy walked into my yard 3 years ago looking for water for his horse. I told him he was a damn fool for going into that gulch. Every man in the county knows what's in there. Scorpions, rattlesnakes, empty rock. He turned back to the stove and picked up an iron kettle. He laughed at me. He said scorpions didn't bother a man who didn't bother them. Then he sat down at this table right where you are sitting, and he ate my chili, and he told me the names of every plant growing in the wash behind my corral. He knew more than a man ought to know unless he had been paying a peculiar kind of attention. Her throat closed once and released. That was my husband. Barnaby set the kettle back on the stove. He turned. He looked at her fully for the first time, and his eyes were the pale washed blue of a man who had spent 7 decades in strong light. He passed. 10 days ago. He was silent for a long count. Then he said, "Your husband told me a thing when he was here the second time. He said if a woman with a small girl ever came down this trail with a canvas bag looking for the canyon, that woman was his wife, and I was to help her." The tin spoon in her hand shook once and stilled. He said that. He said that. Barnaby moved to a peg on the wall and lifted down a battered felt hat. "I have a mule. She is old, but her feet know these stones. I will take you the rest of the way after your child has rested." He would not accept money, she offered. He waved the hand that had held the kettle in a small flat motion that ended the discussion. What he did accept was the promise she made without being asked to make it, the promise that if he ever needed help, he would send word to the canyon and it would come. He nodded once at that and did not speak of it again. While Josephine napped for 2 hours on a straw pallet in the coolest corner of the largest room, Winifred sat on the packed dirt of the yard, with her back against the shaded wall of the adobe, and drank a second bowl of chili that Barnaby set beside her without comment. She watched the goats in their stone corral. She thought about the sentence he had spoken. He said if a woman with a small girl ever came down this trail, her husband had prepared this old man for her. He had prepared her arrival at a stranger's door 2 days into the desert. She began to understand, sitting there with the empty bowl warming her fingers, that she had been walking not into wilderness, but into a shape her husband had drawn. They left Barnaby's ranch in the middle of the afternoon, with Josephine on the back of the mule and Winifred walking alongside. The child had the reins wound loose around one small hand in the way Barnaby had shown her, and she was sitting with the straight-back pride of a person who has been given a serious responsibility for the first time in her life. Barnaby walked ahead of them. He said almost nothing across the next 3 hours. Once he stopped to point out the second dry wash, a stretch of white sand and smooth stones where water would move in the wet months, and where in early September there was only heat and silence. He turned them southeast at that point. The trail thickened again. The vegetation shifted. Winifred began to notice, without saying anything, the small, deliberate signs of use along the way. A branch snapped in a certain manner. A stone displaced from a position that gravity would not have chosen, a mark carved shallow into the trunk of a saguaro that could have been accidental, and that in the accumulated context was not. The wall of Mesquite and Palo Fierro appeared without preamble. One moment they were walking through open desert with the sun on their left shoulders. The next moment there was a green density ahead of them, thick and closed, 10 feet tall in places and broken. Barnaby raised a hand and stopped the mule. He said, "This is where I leave you." He said it not as a farewell, but as a boundary he understood belonged to somebody else. "The opening is to your right about 30 paces, between 2 big mesquites. You'll smell the water when you get close." Winifred looked at the wall of vegetation, and she looked at the old man, and something in her chest was doing the work of both gratitude and grief at the same time. "How can I ever thank you?" He handed her the reins of the mule. He said, "That is not the kind of thing you pay back. That is the kind of thing you pass along." He touched the brim of his hat once to Josephine, who lifted her small hand in return with the gravity of a person acknowledging a treaty, and then he turned and began walking back the way they had come, without looking back, the way a man walks who is confident of his own direction and does not need to check whether anyone is watching him go. The opening was where he had said it would be. 2 mesquites with trunks as thick as a man's chest, their roots buckling the ground on either side into what could only be described as a threshold. She stood before it for a long moment. Josephine looked down at her from the back of the mule. The child said, "Do we go in, Mommy?" Winifred took a breath that reached deeper than any breath she had taken in 7 days. She thought of the hazel eyes. She thought of the ink on the fingers. She thought of the 7 words. "We go in." Beyond the threshold, the world changed. Not with drama, not all at once, but the way things change when a person crosses from one climate into another. The canyon opened around them. The walls of stone rose 15 or 20 meters on either side, gray granite streaked with quartz, and the space between them was wider than she had guessed from the outside, perhaps 130 feet at its broadest. The floor of the canyon was covered with vegetation that had no business existing in this country. Reeds along a bright thread of moving water, wild fig trees with their gray-green leaves, a drooping willow whose branches touched the ground within a stone's throw of the entrance. The smell of water was strong here inside an undeniable presence. Birds spoke from the vegetation in a variety of voices she associated with places where shade and moisture were permanent. She helped Josephine down from the mule. The child took 3 steps forward on her own with her eyes very wide. She whispered without turning around, "Mommy, this is where Papa was when he wasn't with us." Winifred did not answer at once. The whisper had struck her in the place behind her breastbone that was still tender from the burial. "I think this is where he was building for us." She saw the house then. It stood at the deepest curve of the canyon's widest section, set against the northern wall to catch the summer shade and the winter sun, which was precisely the reasoning her husband would have used. Not a shack, not an isolated room, a house, in the shape of an L with 2 clearly defined wings, a roof of mesquite beams and mud and reed, a heavy wooden front door with black wrought iron fittings that she could see from 100 paces was solid, well hung, well fitted. The walls were the same ochre as the canyon rock, and they seemed to grow out of it. Someone who did not know the house was there might walk past the mouth of the canyon and miss it entirely. She led the mule forward slowly. The details grew sharper as they approached. The roof beams extended past the walls and eaves long enough to shade a person standing directly against the adobe. The 2 front windows were sunk deep into the mass of the walls, the way windows are sunk when the walls are more than 2 feet thick. The front porch was flagstone laid without mortar, but fitted with the tight precision of a man who had refused to move on to the next piece until the current piece was seated properly. To the right, half covered by a reed shelter that had clearly been built as a working roof, stood a wellhead of squared timber with a pulley mechanism and a metal bucket. To the left, following a line of stone that came down from the canyon wall, ran a stone channel sealed with lime and clay that carried a steady thread of water down from some seep in the rock face and distributed it in a network of smaller irrigation ditches to 5 rectangular plots of soil, leveled and edged empty in early September, because no one had planted them, but darker and finer than the ordinary soil of the desert. Prepared, waited on, ready. She stood a long moment in front of it all. Josephine stood beside her without speaking. Winifred touched the paper folded against her breast beneath her blouse, the way a woman in a church touches a rosary, and she understood in that quiet before entering that the sentence her husband had written in the tightest hand she had ever known him to use had not been a whisper or a warning. It had been a deed. She reached her hand up beneath the collar of her dress and drew out the iron key she had been carrying without understanding why she had been carrying it since the night of the wake. It was a plain, heavy key with a cross-shaped bow. She had found it in the small wooden box on Thaddeus's side of the dresser the same night she had found the paper, and she had kept it because keeping small things her husband had touched felt important then. Now she stepped up onto the flagstone porch and slid the key into the padlock on the heavy wooden door. The lock turned with a clean, small click, the click of a mechanism that had been oiled recently, the click of a lock that had been maintained by someone who had wanted her to succeed at this exact moment. The door swung inward with the soft chirp of hinges that had been tended to. The air of the house met her adobe and old wood, and a faint sweetness she could not immediately name, and she stepped inside. The main room was larger than the exterior had suggested. Whoever had planned this had used every inch of the interior with an efficiency that spoke of a mind that had drawn the floor plan more than once before committing it to the ground. A heavy table of rough-hewn mesquite stood in the center of the room with 2 chairs waiting. An adobe cookstove filled the near corner with its chimney flue rising straight through the roof, and when she rapped her knuckles against that flue, it answered with the deep muffled note of masonry that had been built to last a lifetime. Shelves lined the north wall. On the shelves in sackcloth and tin and small stoneware crocks sat provisions. Not the abandoned provisions of a place someone had left in a hurry. Arranged provisions, placed provisions, corn, beans, dried chilies, salt in a jar with a lid that fit, brown sugar loaves wrapped in paper, coffee ground and sealed in a wax-mouthed leather pouch, rice, a supply that had been calculated by a man who had considered how many people would be in this house and for how long, and what they would need at the end of a hard journey to eat their first meal without walking back out into the country to hunt for it. Josephine had followed her inside. The child walked to the mesquite table and placed both her small palms flat against the wood and stood there feeling it. The child said without looking up, "Papa made this table." It was not a question. Winifred came and stood behind her and rested a hand on the top of her head. "He did. He made it for us." She could not have added another sentence in that moment. She turned to the upper shelves and began with hands that were not quite steady to inventory the tools. A small hoe, a shovel, a hand mallet, a handsaw with the teeth still sharp, a carpenter's level, its bubble intact under its bright brass window, coils of rope in 3 thicknesses, nails sorted by size into small canvas pouches. On the lowest shelf, a hurricane lamp with its reservoir full, a tin box of matches wrapped in wax cloth, a small stack of tallow candles. Everything her husband had thought a woman would need to begin a life in this place, with no man to hunt for her and no town to walk to. She explored the rest of the house before the light failed. The right wing of the L held what was clearly intended as a bedroom with 2 low platforms of adobe raised from the floor. At the height, a straw mattress would want to sit smooth and clean. The window of that room faced the well so that on a still night the water in its depth would be audible from the bed if the world outside was quiet enough. The left wing of the L was closed by a second door. This door was smaller. It was hung in the same walnut she had recognized in the front door, but it was thicker and it had a second padlock that did not match the first. The iron key she was carrying would not open it. She tried. The key was wrong. She stood before that door for a while and understood that the house had one more thing to give her, and it would have to wait for another moment. They cooked beans that first evening on the adobe stove with wood from a stack outside the door that had been split and laid in a covered lean-to, enough dry wood for weeks. She lit the hurricane lamp when the sun dropped below the western rim of the canyon and the interior went dim. She fed the child. She washed the 2 bowls at the well with water she drew for herself, for the first time watching the metal bucket come up dark with cold, clean water that tasted of granite and depth. She sat with Josephine on the flagstone porch when the child was full, and the stars had begun their appearance in the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. She thought that she had never seen stars framed like this, cut on both sides by rock, so that what remained above was a corridor of blackened light. Josephine leaned her head against her mother's arm and was asleep within a quarter of an hour. Winifred carried the child inside to one of the adobe platforms and laid her on the folded blanket. She covered her with the shawl. She went back out onto the porch. The lamp was low. The night in the canyon had a temperature of its own, cooler than the country outside, kept honest by the water and the stone. The sound of the stone channel was constant and small, a thread of movement that would not stop as long as the seep in the wall did not fail. Somewhere higher in the canyon, an owl asked its question of the dark, and the dark did not answer. She stood at the edge of the porch. She looked up at the strip of stars, and Winifred Halloran Ashcombe cried for the first time since her husband had died. She had not cried at the wake. She had not cried at the burial. She had not cried during the 6 days of the taking. She cried now silently with her hand across her mouth so as not to wake the child, because the shape her husband had drawn across 4 years of Saturdays had opened itself to her with such completeness that grief and gratitude could no longer be told apart. She cried for 10 or 12 minutes. She dried her face with the shawl. She went back inside. The 3rd day at the canyon began the work of learning what a place taught a person who was going to live in it. She walked the water channel to its source and found the seep in the north wall about 7 meters above the floor, a slow, constant thread from a crack in the granite that her husband had captured with a small housing of stone and clay and directed downward through the channel he had cut. She walked the 5 plots and studied the soil. She turned it in her hand and understood that the darkness of it was the result of years of enrichment, mule dung and river silt and lime, worked in patiently across the seasons. A man had been coming here on his Saturdays. She walked the wall of the northern face and found at knee height, exactly where he had promised in the 7-word paper's hidden logic, a small cross incised into the rock at the base of a band of stone that under the noon light took on an iridescent quality different from the darker basalt above and below it. She did not know rock the way her husband had learned to know rock. She knew, though, from the years of desert winters, that a difference in color at the base of a wall was a difference in the story of that wall, and she pressed her palm flat against the band of pale stone and felt only its ordinary coldness, and she filed the observation away. The fourth day brought a visitor. Winifred was on her knees at the edge of the middle plot, harvesting a handful of wild bean pods that had come up on their own from seed carried by birds, when she heard a low whistle from the direction of the mesquite gate. Not the whistle of a person calling out, the whistle of a person announcing herself so that she would not appear suddenly in another woman's ground. Winifred rose. Her hand went to the pocket of her apron where the kitchen knife rode. She waited. The woman who appeared at the threshold was small and stood upright in a way that made her age difficult to place. 65 perhaps, or 70. White hair braided in a thick rope down her back. A dark cotton skirt. A muslin blouse. Leather work shoes. A woven palm basket over her left forearm covered with a cloth. She waited at the mesquites and did not step through. Good morning. The greeting had a courtesy in it that was also a form of asking permission. Winifred left her hand where it was in the apron pocket. Good morning. My name is Prudence Whitlock. I live with my son and his wife at Dry Fork, an hour that way. Word came that someone had arrived in the canyon. How does word come? The smoke of the stove. 4 years without smoke. Suddenly smoke. In the desert, one notices these things. Winifred studied her. She said, "Did you know my husband?" The old woman's eyes changed, not in expression exactly, but in temperature. They warmed. Mr. Ashcombe, yes, I knew him. He was a good man. He died 2 weeks ago. Prudence Whitlock lowered her head an inch and held it there. I know. Word reached me by the trail. That is why I came. She lifted the basket. I brought some things. Seed for the second planting, and a little food for today. Winifred took her hand out of the apron pocket. She said, come in. Prudence stayed the afternoon and into the following morning. She was the sort of person whose knowledge did not announce itself, but appeared in the ordinary passage of conversation, the way water rises slowly in a well without notice, until one day the well is full. She knew the country the way Winifred knew it. She knew the medicinal plants with the intimacy of a woman who had walked the same hillsides for 50 years. She had first met Thaddeus in the second summer of his coming to the canyon. He had ridden up to Dry Fork looking for water for his horse, and had stayed to eat because Prudence had insisted, and because Thaddeus had been the sort of man who accepted the hospitality of strangers without the awkwardness that some educated men brought to a rancher's kitchen. They had spoken that first night about land and about maps and about the canyon, and from that night forward, Prudence had been the only person in the county who knew what Thaddeus was doing and for whom he was doing it. Not every detail, not the letter and not the locked room, but the existence of the house and the person it was being built for. He told me it was for you, Prudence said, seated in one of the 2 chairs at the mesquite table with a mug of coffee between her palms. He said if anything happened to him, you would need it. He said, my wife is a woman the country does not frighten. She will know what to do. Winifred listened to this with her own coffee going cold in her hands. She asked what was in the locked room. Prudence shook her head. No, he told me that was between the 2 of you. A pause. Do you have the key? I have the key to the front padlock. I have not found the other one. Prudence drank her coffee. She looked at the far wall. She checked the central roof beam. She said, in the central beam. Mr. Ashcombe showed me once and did not say why. There is a groove cut in the underside of the beam over the table. Winifred set down her coffee. She took up the hurricane lamp. She moved the table 2 feet to the side. She stood on one of the chairs and raised the lamp toward the mesquite beam that crossed the room from wall to wall. On the underside, precisely at the midpoint, was a rectangular notch about 2 inches long and 1 inch deep cut, with a knife by a man who had known no one would look up unless they had been told to look up. She put her finger in. She touched something small cold wrapped in muslin. She drew out the second key. She held it in her palm for longer than it might have appeared from outside. It was a smaller key than the first, its bow shaped like a cross, forged specifically for a lock and not stamped in a shop. It had been oiled and wrapped and cared for, and it was warm inside her closed hand within seconds. Prudence Whitlock stood beside the table with her hands folded in front of her, the posture of a person who understood that what came next did not belong to her and would nevertheless be witnessed. Josephine sat on the floor near the front door, drawing with a bit of charcoal on the flagstones, the shape she saw in the walls of the canyon absorbed in a game she had invented for herself that morning, and that took all of her attention. Winifred said, "Would you like to wait outside?" Prudence said, "No, stay." She went to the smaller door. She had to duck slightly to fit her head under its lintel, which meant Thaddeus, who had been more than 6 feet, would have had to bend further, and the thought of him bending under this doorway on some Saturday afternoon in the shade of this canyon flooded her briefly and passed. The wood was walnut, the hardest and most enduring in the region. The woodmen used for the doors of banks and courthouses because it did not yield to anything easily. The second padlock hung at the center of the door at chest height. It was of the same black iron as the first, but its keyway was the shape of the cross that matched the bow of the small key. She fitted the key. She turned. The lock opened. She pushed the door in and the walnut swung inward with a movement so slow and quiet that the hinges of this second room had clearly been given more attention than any other hinges in the house. The room had no window. The darkness inside it was absolute until she raised the lamp. Its walls, when the light fell across them, were plastered with a coat of white lime that returned the flame multiplied around a small squared space, perhaps 12 feet on a side. In the center of the room stood a low table of mesquite smaller than the one in the kitchen. On that low table, arranged with a care that did not surprise her by then, sat a stack of survey maps, a ledger with a leather cover, a wooden chest with brass hasps, and laid on top of the chest, as if it had been placed last, when everything else was already in position, a thick folded packet of papers bound with a red cord, on the outer face of which her husband had written, in the same tight small hand she had first seen bent over a map on a flat rock outside Prescott. For Winifred, read only when you are ready. She took up the papers first. She took the single chair that stood before the low table, a chair placed as if her husband had known there would be one person doing this reading and no more. She untied the red cord. She unfolded the first sheet. The letter of Thaddeus Ashcombe to his wife had been written on 38 pages of the finest and most durable paper. The mercantile at Copper Hollow sold the paper used for important documents in the small crowded hand she had watched bend over maps and ledgers for a decade. There were no strike-throughs. There were no visible corrections, which meant this was not the draft. This was the fair copy, which meant there had been an earlier version he had written and corrected and rewritten until he was satisfied. Winifred, my love, if you are reading this, it is because I could not protect you any other way. But I could. I did. And now I want to explain everything to you. Everything I did not tell you in life. Everything I kept silent about for reasons that seemed sufficient then, and that seemed to me now writing this perhaps not sufficient at all, but they were the reasons I had, and I owe them to you complete. She read on. She read the whole of it without lifting her eyes from the pages at the pace her mother had taught her to read without skipping, because what is written whole. She read that when Thaddeus had worked with the surveyor in his 22nd year, he had learned to read the land in a way the surveyor never taught him, but that she in the desert had taught him instead. She read that the man who drew the official maps had instructions to mark this southeastern strip of the county as land without designation, land without value, because a rancher named Reuben Blackwood, whose name appeared in every municipal minute for the last 20 years, had wanted the surrounding lands to remain unvalued so that he could buy them cheap when the moment came. She read that the canyon had water not from the seasonal wash, but from a deep aquifer, a subterranean formation that the authorities of the Northern Territory had not yet mapped, whose existence Thaddeus had inferred from indicators of vegetation and from the type of rock and from the drainage pattern of the country around it. She read that he had known this since the year he was 22. She read that he had kept the knowledge silent for the better part of a decade because he had not known what to do with it. He had no money to buy the land. He had no influence to defend it. She read that in the year of their 4th wedding anniversary, he had begun to research the title of that canyon in the archives of the Territorial Land Office and had discovered something extraordinary. The canyon was registered as unclaimed since 1854. The last recorded owner, a man named Whitmore, had died without known heirs. The parcel had passed nominally to the territory, but had lingered in a bureaucratic limbo where no one had bothered to reclaim it because no one had understood it was worth reclaiming. She read that this made the canyon available under the doctrine of adverse possession, which meant that whoever lived on it worked it and could demonstrate continuous occupation and improvement over the required period could petition the court for legal title. She read that he had been preparing exactly that petition for 4 years. She read that he had done 3 things. He had built the house, he had documented his possession in 46 recorded visits, each with date-hour description of work and signature. He had collected the written testimonies of 3 witnesses who had seen him working the canyon and would be willing to testify to it. Barnaby Quill of the Goat Ranch on the trail, Prudence Whitlock of Dry Fork, a retired miner named Silas Redfern in Tombstone who had passed through the canyon on 2 separate occasions and had agreed to depose to it. She read that Thaddeus had further identified the right lawyer to bring the case. Not Silas Ramsden of Copper Hollow, an honest man, a small one without the reach to withstand pressure from Blackwood, if Blackwood learned what was at stake. The lawyer she needed was Ezekiel Marbury of Tucson. He had trained at Yale. He had connections in the Territorial Supreme Court. He had won 3 adverse possession cases in the region across the last 8 years. He had won a water rights case against Reuben Blackwood in the year 1888, and Blackwood had lost. Marbury's address was in the chest. Thaddeus had written to him in 1888 describing the situation in general terms without disclosing the canyon's location, and Marbury had responded that if the documents were solid, the case was viable. The documents were solid. Now, Winifred, my love, I need to tell you something that will hurt, and I am sorry. I know Cornelius will attempt to take the house on Mesquite Street. I know it because I know my brother and I love him. Yes, I love him, though what he will do in the days after my death will be difficult to forgive. I know the law will side with him because the law of this territory, in this year of 1889, does not protect you as it should. This is why I never put anything in your name. Anything in your name, Cornelius or his allies at the courthouse would have found a way to attack. The canyon has no name on any map. It is not in any deed. It does not exist for the legal system, which means Cornelius cannot take it because he cannot take what does not exist. But you can make it exist. You, with this documentation and with Marbury and with the time the process will require, can turn this canyon into legal property in your name and in the name of Josephine. When you do, you will not have a small ranch in the hills. You will have control over the only access to a subterranean aquifer in this stretch of the county. What that is worth today is more than anyone in the county can calculate. What it will be worth in 20 years is more still, because the Northern Territory is going to dry and water is going to become the most valuable thing there is. There is one more thing I need to tell you, one that is in no document. On the northern wall of the canyon, about 80 meters from the house, there is a rock formation that on the surface looks like ordinary basalt. But if you look at the base of that wall carefully, and I marked it with a small cross cut into the stone at knee height, you will see that the rock has a different color in a band about 10 feet long. That is not basalt. That is quartz porphyry. In this region, in this specific geological formation, quartz porphyry is an indicator of mineralization. I do not tell you there is silver. I am not a miner. I tell you that Silas Redfern, who is a miner and who came into the canyon with me twice, said to me, Mr. Ashcombe, if that were my ground, the first thing I would do is drill core samples in that wall. His exact words were, that deserves someone taking a close look. He knows how to do it. His address is also in the chest. Winifred, I know these years of absent Saturdays weighed on you. I know there were moments when you wondered whether I was hiding something bad from you, whether there was another woman, whether there were debts, whether there was anything I ought to have been ashamed of. There was none of that. There was this. There was this house I built with my hands thinking of you in every brick. There was that, well, I spent 2 months digging, and the first time it gave clean water, I sat down on the floor of this canyon and cried the way I had not cried since my father lost the use of his hand, because I knew I had done something with my own that no accident could take from us. There were these plots of prepared soil that you who know the country better than I do will know what to plant and when. I asked very little of you during our marriage. I let the law leave you with nothing because it was what the law did and because I could not change the law. What I could do is what you see here. Take care of Josephine. She has your eyes for reading the country and my head for the numbers. She is going to be an extraordinary woman. And Winnie, this is what I most want you to know. I never neglected you. I never forgot you. In every Saturday I was gone, in every night I spent with the map on the table, in every brick of that house you raised, without knowing that someone else was also raising a house, I was thinking of you. Always. You first. Your Thaddeus. Postscript. The river that runs behind the canyon, the one that comes out through the southern wall, does not appear on any map of the territory. I verified this 4 times. which means access to that river is tied to whoever owns the canyon. The river has water year-round. The flatlands south of the canyon where the river opens out are 15 acres of fertile ground no one has worked. I leave that for you to discover. Winifred read the letter through without stopping. 38 pages. When she reached the postscript about the river and the 15 acres, she lowered the papers into her lap and rested her head against the white plastered wall of the small room, and she wept in a way that was different from the way she had wept the second night on the porch. This weeping had many things inside it at once. Grief for Thaddeus that she still had not finished processing. Rage at the 6 days of the taking on Mesquite Street. The physical relief of understanding that she was not alone in the way she had thought she was alone. The unbearable tenderness of imagining Thaddeus sitting in this same chair, writing in every brick you raised, "I was thinking of you." And the astonishment of understanding that the man she had loved for 10 years had spent 4 of those 10 years building a way out for her in silence, without telling her, because if he told her, the fear or the hope might take it from him before it was ready. She wept for 12 minutes. Prudence Whitlock stood at the door of the small room the whole time present, but discreet in the posture of a woman who knew how to keep company without intruding. When the weeping was done, Prudence stepped forward and placed one hand on Winifred's shoulder. A single hand, no words. Josephine entered this room at that moment. She had heard the crying, and she had come with the silent feet of children who learn to move through houses when something important is happening. She approached her mother, laid her head against Winifred's lap on top of the folded papers, and Winifred held her. The 3 women, the 29, the 6, the 68, remained in silence in that small white room for a while that no one measured. Then Winifred wiped her face with the shawl, folded the letter carefully, and slipped it inside her blouse against her chest, in the same place she had carried the paper of 7 words across the whole journey. The chest opened without ceremony. It had no lock, only a brass lever hasp. She opened it herself. Inside were the 46 field notebooks, each recording a visit with date and hour and description and signature. 27 receipts from Mercantiles in Copper Hollow, Tucson, and Prescott for lumber, adobe, brick, lime, iron fittings, dressed stone, and the wooden bucket for the well. 3 sealed envelopes containing the witness testimonies of Quill Whitlock and Redfern. And when Prudence saw her own name on one of the envelopes, she nodded once unsurprised, because Thaddeus had asked for that testimony in life, and she had given it in life. There was a thicker envelope with the correspondence with Ezekiel Marbury, 2 letters from Thaddeus, and 1 measured professional response, confirming what her husband had already summarized in the long letter. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in the same muslin cloth that had protected the second key, lay something Winifred had not been prepared for. $320 in banknotes of the Bank of Arizona Territory, folded and ordered, with a small paper note in her husband's hand. "For the lawyer and for whatever else you may need." She counted the money twice, then a third time, not because she doubted the sum, but because her hands needed to do something concrete, while her head processed the magnitude of what was happening. $320. She had walked out of the house on Mesquite Street with 43. She wrapped the money again and set it back in the chest. She turned to Prudence. "Do you understand what I have here?" "I think I do." Prudence stood with her hands folded in the same posture in which she had waited during the reading of the letter, but her voice was quiet and direct in the manner of a woman who had watched a long life and had little patience for evasions. "What you have here is what your husband would call a solid case. I would tell you it is more than that. Those 15 acres by the river he mentions, I know that stretch. Water there 12 months of the year. Better ground than anything Blackwood owns in the north of the county." Winifred looked at her. "You know Reuben Blackwood." Everyone who has lived 50 years in this territory knows Reuben Blackwood. The tone was neither fearful nor admiring, only exact. "He has land, he has cattle, he has the sheriff, he has 2 judges of the district court. What he does not have is Ezekiel Marbury. Marbury beat him last year on a water rights suit and Blackwood lost. Your husband chose well." Winifred was silent a moment. "My husband chose well in several things." "Your husband," Prudence answered, and the sentence held more inside it than its length suggested, "chose well in several things." That night, after Prudence had gone with a promise to return within the week bringing more seed and news from Barnaby, Winifred sat alone on the porch with the lamp unlit to save the oil in the sky of the canyon over her. Josephine slept inside. She thought of Cornelius Ashcombe. She thought of the house on Mesquite Street which by now would have been completely reorganized to Hester's comfort, with Thaddeus's furniture replaced or sold, and Winifred's stoneware Crocs on Hester's shelf. She thought of the laugh Cornelius had let out when she announced Mesquite Canyon. She thought of the 15 acres of fertile ground that the unnamed river would water 12 months a year. She thought of the quartz porphyry on the northern wall. She thought of the aquifer no government surveyor had mapped. She thought of Ezekiel Marbury in Tucson, who the year before had beaten the man who had the sheriff and 2 district judges in his pocket. And for the first time since her husband had begun to sicken, for the first time in weeks of fear and exhaustion and dispossession, Winifred felt something that was not exactly hope, because hope always has something fragile in it. It was another thing. It was the quiet certainty of solid ground beneath the feet, the certainty of a person who has walked 2 days through the desert with a small child in a canvas satchel and arrived where she needed to arrive. She looked up at the stars in the canyon corridor. She closed her eyes. She began to plan. The plan required 3 steps, and she was clear about them by the time the lamp inside would have burned itself out if she had bothered to light it. The first step was to write to Ezekiel Marbury in Tucson and enclose enough of the $320 to pay for the messenger and the initial retainer he would require, and to request a meeting at his earliest convenience. The second step was to walk to the northern wall and mark beside the small cross her husband had cut into the rock her own sign so that the mark of the 2 of them would sit together on the same stone. The third step was to prepare the plots for the small autumn planting chili and beans and squash, because the first principle of survival in the country was that the ground did not wait for anyone to finish planting. The letter to Ezekiel Marbury left the canyon in Prudence Whitlock's hand on her second visit exactly a week after her first, as she had promised. She had brought seed and news, and she was willing to carry the letter as far as the trail station at Fort Lowell, where the weekly mail rider passed on Thursdays for Tucson. Winifred gave her the letter and $40 from the chest to cover postage and to buy small things Prudence herself needed: salt, soap, heavy thread for mending. The reply from Ezekiel Marbury arrived 5 weeks later. In those 5 weeks, she had planted the plots one by one, following the calendar Thaddeus had noted in the back of one of the field books. She had learned that the east plots caught the morning sun and the afternoon shade and were ideal for chili and tomato. That the west plots, which reversed the pattern, were perfect for squash. That the central plot where the water channel discharged with more volume was for beans. She had repaired 3 roof beams of reed that had weakened with the July rains, learning by trial with the tools her husband had left, and celebrating the third and successful repair with a cup of hot coffee on the porch at 5 in the afternoon as the canyon walls turned orange under the light of the setting sun. The letter from Marbury, when it came, was written on 2 pages of thick paper with his name embossed on the upper corner. It confirmed in the professional idiom of a man whose words carried consequences that her case presented solid grounds for a proceeding under the adverse possession statutes of the territory. His fee would be $50 retained now against the costs of registry investigation and travel, and $150 payable upon successful conclusion. $200 in total. The chest had $320. She read the final paragraph 3 times. If you can travel to Tucson or Phoenix in the coming weeks with the documentation you describe, we can commence the process without further delay. Time is a factor. She went to Prudence's ranch that afternoon and asked whether Josephine could remain there for a week while she rode to Tucson. Prudence said she had been expecting to be asked. The ride to Tucson took 4 days. Winifred left the canyon before dawn on a Monday in the second week of November, mounted on a 9-year-old mare that Prudence Whitlock's son Jeremiah had lent her without a fuss and without a fee. A plain brown animal called Sadie with no ambition and a steady gait. The leather satchel with the documents rode against her hip on the same side her canteen had ridden during the walk from Copper Hollow. The $320 had been reduced to $280 by the letter she had sent in Prudence's hand 5 weeks earlier, and those $280 were divided among 4 separate places in her clothing so that a single misfortune on the road could not undo her. Josephine had watched her mount up from the porch of the ranch at Dry Fork with an expression that was more curious than sad, a small hand raised in a wave, the older widow's arm steady around the child's shoulder. The mare had taken the trail south at the deliberate walking pace of an animal that understood a long ride was in front of it and did not need to be told to conserve. She crossed the wide, dry country between the canyon and the Gila Valley on the first day. She slept the first night at a small way station run by a Mormon family who fed her salted pork and beans and would not accept payment for the meal, only for the corn her mare ate at the trough. She spoke very little at that supper. She was not accustomed yet to strangers who did not want anything from her, and the kindness of the Mormon woman, who set a hand on her shoulder in passing without a word, threatened for a moment to undo the composure she had cultivated across the last 2 months. She recovered it. She thanked the woman in the morning and rode on. On the second day, the country flattened and the mesquites thickened along the washes, and she began to see in the distance the smoke of the small settlements that clustered along the freight road to the south. She camped alone the second night in a mesquite bosque, with the mare hobbled a few feet from her blanket, and she slept the sleep of a person whose exhaustion had at last found permission to be honest with itself. On the third morning, she rode into a livery on the outskirts of a town called Florence, stabled Sadie for the $2 rate the ostler charged, and continued the last miles into Tucson on the freight coach. Tucson in November of 1889 was larger than she had expected. Wagons crowded the main streets. New brick buildings shouldered up between the older adobe ones. Storefronts in English and in Spanish. A rail spur brought lumber down from the north. Men in the suits of the newer commerce moved among the men in the older canvas of the ranches, and the sound of a hammer somewhere at every hour of the day marked the fact that the town was still becoming itself. She found the office of Ezekiel Marbury on Congress Street, on the second floor of a plastered stone building with a black lacquered door and his name in gold leaf on the pebbled glass. She climbed the stairs with the leather satchel across her body and a plainness in her dress that she chose deliberately because she did not want her clothing to speak before she did. She knocked. A young clerk showed her into an inner office. Ezekiel Marbury rose from his desk. He was 52 tall, bald across the crown with a fringe of gray at his temples and a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles that he removed to shake her hand and did not put back on for the rest of the meeting. He had the deliberateness of movement that she had noticed in a certain kind of educated man, a habit that spoke of a mind that considered the placement of each object before setting it down. He offered her coffee. He offered her the chair across from him. He asked how her ride had been. He did not open the satchel or ask her to open it until she had drunk the coffee halfway down and the small pleasantries had done their work. The meeting lasted 4 hours. He reviewed each of the 46 field books that Thaddeus had left. He read the 3 witness testimonies. I examined the 27 receipts and asked her at 3 separate points to explain a specific date or the significance of a particular purchase. He measured the paper of one of the field notebooks between his thumb and forefinger and remarked on its quality. He set the whole of the record down at last and folded his hands on top of it. Your husband did an extraordinary piece of work. I have not seen a possession record this complete outside of the files of wealthy ranchers who hire lawyers to prepare it in advance. My husband was meticulous. Your husband knew exactly what he was doing and precisely why he was doing it. A pause. Does anyone else know the location of this canyon? Anyone influential? She said the name without hesitation. Reuben Blackwood. Marbury's hands did not move on top of the papers. His eyes lifted to hers and held for a longer beat. Does Blackwood know it has water? My husband writes in the letter that the official maps mark it as valueless. Blackwood has the men who make the maps in his pocket. Then we must move quickly. If Blackwood discovers the value of the canyon before we have registered your possession, he will have the resources to complicate the process. Not to defeat it if the documentation holds, but to stretch it, to bleed it, to make it expensive enough that you might consider settling. He stood. You begin tomorrow at first light. We go to the land office. Tucson had a small hotel called the Palace on Meyer Street, where a woman traveling without a husband could take a room without invitation to explain herself. And Winifred took one there for $1 a night. She ate her supper alone in the dining room and studied without appearing to the men who passed through the lobby. She was learning to look at strangers now, not as strangers, but as possible instruments or possible obstacles, and the change in her own vision was a thing she noticed with a small private melancholy. It was a way of seeing that she had inherited whole from 6 days on Mesquite Street. She wondered whether the seeing would ever leave her again. She suspected it would not. The land office was in a squat brick building on Court Street, and the clerk who handled adverse possession filings was a thin man with ink on his cuffs who did not appear to have smiled since childhood. Marbury took her through the door at 8 in the morning of her 4th day in the city. The clerk received the packet, listened to Marbury's summary, and set the whole of it in a wire basket at his elbow, with the announcement that the case file of another party had been misplaced in the previous week, and that its recovery was going to require the office's attention for perhaps 4 days. Marbury did not raise his voice. He did not press. He said, "We will return." He turned to Winifred in the hallway. "Waiting is part of it. Sit tight." She sat on a bench in the corridor across the 4 days that followed. She learned the faces of the people who waited with her. A woman from Yuma named Aurelia Cross, who was pressing a claim against the town over a diverted arroyo that had cost her family 2 seasons of alfalfa. An old man from Wickenburg, whose grandfather's ranch title, 3 generations old, had been snarled in a probate dispute that had been running since 1874. A seamstress named Georgia Emmert, who was not there for a case of her own, but for her husband, and who spent an hour describing to Winifred the difference between the price of eggs in Tucson and the price of eggs in Prescott. The corridor had a light that came through a high, dusty window and fell across the tile floor in a pale rectangle, and the rectangle moved across each morning at the same slow angle. She learned it. She began to mark her hours by it. It was on the afternoon of the 3rd day, when the light had crossed the tile to within a hand's breadth of the far bench, that the front door of the building opened and Ambrose Ashcombe walked in. He was 16. He wore a coat that was new. He wore a hat that was new. He carried himself with the stiff formality of a young man who had been sent on an errand and who was not certain quite yet that he was equal to it. His eyes swept the corridor with the quickness of a person looking for someone, and they found her, and they stopped. For a second longer than either of them intended, they looked at each other. Then Ambrose lowered his gaze. He turned. He walked back out the door. He did not speak. Winifred sat very still for the length of a slow breath, and then she rose and went to find Marbury. She did not run. She did not hurry. She had learned in the previous 3 months that the men who moved through the world with visible urgency were the men who lost, and she was not going to lose. She entered his office and stood in front of his desk and said without preamble, "My husband's nephew was just in the land office building. This is not a coincidence." Marbury set down his pen. He asked her whether Cornelius Ashcombe had connections in Tucson. She said she did not know, but that Cornelius had traded cattle across half the territory for 20 years, and it was possible. Marbury was silent for 2 full seconds, which was, she had come to understand his method of thinking. He said, "Then tomorrow we move first. But there is a thing we can do today that does not require the land office. We can file a notarial deposition of your material possession and of the existing documentation before an independent notary of this district. That creates a parallel record that is more difficult to interfere with. It costs $15 extra." "Do it." The notarial office of Josiah Whitcomb was 2 blocks west of Marbury's on the 2nd floor above a druggist. Whitcomb was a lean man with a shock of white hair and an expression that suggested he had been listening to lies for so long that the truth, when it walked in, tended to surprise him. He read Marbury's summary. He examined the field books. He called in 2 clerks from his outer office to serve as witnesses. Winifred signed each of the 4 copies of the deposition with the clear, even letters her mother had taught her, and the pen did not shake. Whitcomb pressed the wax seal onto each copy and stamped the register in his ledger. He handed her 1 copy, retained 1, gave 1 to Marbury, and sent 1 by that afternoon's post to the office of the district clerk. The whole transaction took 40 minutes. When they walked back out onto Congress Street, Marbury paused on the boardwalk and looked at her with the smallest suggestion of a smile she had yet seen from him. "That was fast work, Mrs. Ashcombe. Whoever is trying to interfere is now behind us by a full day and a public record." The land office clerk found the missing file the following morning. He stamped the adverse possession petition into the register at 9:30. He informed Marbury in the bored voice of a man reciting a paragraph. He recited weakly that the process would enter a 90-day period of public notice, during which any interested party could file opposition, and that at the expiration of 90 days, without well-founded opposition, the presiding judge could issue a decision of possession. "And if there is opposition," Winifred asked in the hallway outside, "then we litigate it, and with this documentation we win." She rode home to the canyon in 6 days, breaking the ride to sleep once at Florence, and once at the Mormon way station, and once again in a mesquite bosque along the Gila, where the November nights were cold enough to remind her that the year was turning. Josephine, when she rode into the yard at Dry Fork, ran to the stirrup with a grip on Winifred's boot that lasted longer than the child's ordinary greetings had ever lasted. 9 days for a 6-year-old was a significant portion of the known world. She had learned in that absence to milk Prudence's goat Betsy. She had learned to sift beans for stones. She had learned the names of the 2 ravens that came each morning to the ranch yard looking for scraps. She reported all of this in a rush of small sentences that did not stop until she had climbed into her mother's arms and put her face against her mother's throat. Winifred did not speak for a moment. She held the child and stood in the ranch yard and understood that she had come back with the beginnings of something the men in Tucson could no longer take from her, whatever happened next. The opposition arrived 12 days after her return. Marbury's letter reached Prudence at Dry Fork by the trail rider, and Prudence rode it up to the canyon herself in a light snow that had come down out of the rincones and dusted the mesquite tops on the way. Cornelius had retained a lawyer named Hollister Grimes in Phoenix. Grimes had filed a formal opposition to the adverse possession petition on the ground that the canyon and its improvements might be considered marital property of the Ashcombe Union, and that the surviving brother of the deceased retained an interest that the court was obligated to consider. Marbury's letter was short. "This is the fight we expected. We will win it. His argument depends on proving that your husband either purchased or claimed the land in a formal sense. He did not purchase it. He occupied it. Possession, not purchase, is the ground on which our case stands. Prepare yourself for the process to lengthen by 3 to 5 months. The result will not change." She read the letter twice at the mesquite table. She folded it. She placed it in the chest with the other papers of the case. She did not weep and she did not curse. She had walked through the door on Mesquite Street with $43 and a child, and every day since had been an argument with men who thought a woman without a husband was a woman without recourse. She had come to expect the argument. It was not a novelty anymore. It was work. Silas Redfern arrived at the canyon in the first week of October, a small, dust-colored man in his 60s who rode a red mule and led a second mule behind him, laden with the picks and small chisels and canvas sample bags of his old trade. He had received her letter, and Silas had, being a man who did not stand on ceremony, sent no reply and simply come. He tipped his hat to her at the mesquite gate. He asked to see the wall. She let him. He spent 3 days on the northern face working at the base of the porphyry band, driving small chisels into pockets of the paler rock and dropping fragments into his canvas bags. He hummed while he worked. He drank coffee that Winifred brought out to him at mid-morning and mid-afternoon. He ate the beans and cornbread she set at the mesquite table without commentary. On the evening of the 3rd day, he sat on the flagstone porch with his mug and said, "Mrs. Ashcombe, I am not going to tell you this is a silver mine. There is no way to know that, without deeper drilling and laboratory work, that you may not have the money for at this moment. What I will tell you is this. I have seen a great deal of porphyry across this territory. This one has the type of vein and the type of matrix that in 3 of the last 5 cases I have known personally has led to significant silver mineralization. Not certainty, real possibility." She set her own mug beside his. "What would I need to know for certain? You would need a drilling rig and a geologist from a proper mining school. Or you would need to wait for someone with money to become interested and to pay for the exploration himself in exchange for a percentage." "How much of a percentage?" He turned his weathered eyes on her. "Depends on who arrives first, and on how much information you have on your side of the table. If they arrive when the land is already yours legally, and you have my written notes and the letter of your husband, to prove he knew the ground, you negotiate from a much stronger place than if everything is still in the air." Winifred looked out at the plots. She said, "Then we wait until the land is mine first. That would be my counsel, Mrs. Ashcombe." He left the following morning with his samples and his mules, and a promise that his notes would follow by post within 2 weeks. He also left without being asked the name and address of a mining engineer he trusted at the Colorado School of Mines, Nathaniel Ashford, whose signature had appeared on 3 of the largest silver contracts in the Western Territory across the previous decade. "When you are ready," Silas said at the gate, "write to Ashford. He will come and he will not cheat you." He touched his hat and he rode out. Cornelius rode into the canyon on the last Tuesday of November. He came with Ambrose, and with a broad-shouldered man, Winifred did not recognize a man who wore the coat of someone who worked for a wage and not for himself. Josephine was at Dry Fork that morning, practicing letters at the small pine table Prudence had set aside for her, and Winifred was on the porch shelling the last of the season's dried corn from a canvas sack into a shallow wooden bowl. The frost that had come down in the previous week had left a rime along the edges of the plots that had not yet melted by 10 in the morning. The air in the canyon smelled of wet earth and of the dried chilies that hung in bunches from the eaves of the porch. She saw them come through the mesquite gate. She stayed where she was. She kept her hands in the corn sack and let her eyes follow the three of them the length of the approach. Cornelius stopped 3 paces from the porch. He wore a new hat and a coat of city cut and boots that had been polished before he had set out that morning. His eyes moved over the house, the well, the water channel, the plots, the young winter greens already showing in the middle beds. They moved over Josephine's absence. They came back to Winifred. I see you settled. I settled. What is all this? His voice held something that had not been in it in Copper Hollow. Not contempt, a recalibration. This is the ground your brother prepared for 4 years. I have an adverse possession proceeding open in the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. The broad-shouldered man took a step forward. Cornelius stopped him with a small motion of his hand. He looked at the house again. A legal proceeding. With Ezekiel Marbury of Tucson, the lawyer who won the water rights case against Reuben Blackwood last year, in case that piece of information interests you. A silence stretched long enough that a raven passed overhead, calling once. Cornelius put his hands in his coat pockets. His voice lowered a register into the private tone of family. Winnie, Thaddeus was my brother. This does not have to happen in courtrooms. It is not I who put it in a courtroom. Your attorney in Phoenix filed an opposition. That was you, Cornelius, not me. That was a misunderstanding. Lawyers do things. Lawyers do what their clients ask them to do. Cornelius turned his head and looked at the canyon walls, and she watched him try to fit into his understanding of the world what he was seeing. Did Thaddeus really do all this? With his own hands, for 4 years of Saturdays. There are 46 documented visits with date and hour and description of the work done. There are receipts for every material. There are 3 sworn testimonies from people who watched him work. Ambrose, who had said nothing until now, spoke without shifting his weight. What about the water? Winifred looked at Ambrose. 16 years old, the ash-comb jaw, the eyes that measured what a thing was worth before deciding whether it was interesting. She held his gaze until his gaze moved. The water belongs to the land, and the land is going to be mine. This land could be worth a great deal. I know. Cornelius said, we can come to an arrangement between family, not courts. The land has value. We can divide it. Winifred stood up. She set the wooden bowl aside on the porch railing. She dusted the corn silk from her palms. She looked at Cornelius Ashcombe for the length of a breath she took deliberately to think clearly. She thought about the coffee she had poured him on a Monday in September when he had walked into her kitchen and told her about the practical matter of the house. She thought about the walnut chest of drawers going out the door for $12. She thought about Hester's hand on the top of the stove. She thought about the words he had shouted from the yard on Mesquite Street when she had turned toward the southeast with a canvas satchel and a child. She said in a voice that had grown to fit the woman she had become, quieter than the woman she had been in Copper Hollow, and harder in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Cornelius, you put me out of my own house with $43 and a shawl on the day we buried your brother. There was no arrangement then. There is no arrangement now. Nothing moved for a beat. The broad-shouldered man looked at Cornelius. Ambrose looked at his father. Cornelius looked at Winifred and understood at last the mistake he had made in September, and understood, too, that the mistake could not be unmade by the arrangement he had ridden 2 days to propose. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Marbury will answer Grimes's opposition in the next 2 weeks. If you want to withdraw the opposition before that answer is filed, I would advise you to speak with your lawyer and to ask him how your arguments look next to my documentation. She picked up the wooden bowl again. She sat back down on the porch step. She resumed the shelling of the corn. You must be out of the canyon before sunset. The road back is difficult in the dark. They rode out. They did not speak. She sat on the porch and shelled the corn without looking up until she heard the last of the hoofbeats pass through the mesquite gate, and then her hands trembled for 1 second, and then they stopped trembling. Prudence returned with Josephine an hour later on the back of Prudence's own mule and asked no questions, and Winifred offered no answers, and the 2 women worked together in the kitchen making biscuits for supper as if the visit had never occurred, though both of them knew it had, and both of them knew what it meant. The opposition of Cornelius Ashcombe was withdrawn 12 days later. The letter from Marbury arrived through the mail rider at Dry Fork, and Prudence carried it up to the canyon herself. Grimes contacted my office this morning informing me that his client is withdrawing the opposition for reasons of family convenience. The process continues without obstacle. I expect the judge's decision in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Winifred read the letter twice. She folded it. She placed it in the chest with the field books and the receipts and the deposition and the 38-page letter. The judgment reached her on the 11th of January, 1890. She was in the plots pulling the last of the winter chard when Prudence came through the Mesquite gate calling her name, and Prudence's voice carried a quality that told Winifred before she had even climbed out of the bed of soil that the wait was over. She washed her hands at the well. She sat down at the mesquite table. She read it there slowly with the lamp lit, even though the day was bright, because a moment of that wait required the light she chose, and not the light the sky offered. The Territorial Supreme Court, in the matter of the petition of Winifred Halloran Ashcombe, widow of Thaddeus Ashcombe, for adverse possession of the parcel known as Ashcombe Canyon in the county of Copper Hollow, Territory of Arizona, having reviewed the evidence submitted and having received no well-founded opposition, following the 90-day period of public notice, does hereby recognize the said Winifred Halloran Ashcombe as the lawful proprietor in fee simple of the described parcel, comprising 43 acres as measured by the court's surveyor and inclusive of the water rights of the enclosed spring and of the unnamed river that traverses the southern boundary. 43 acres, not just the canyon, the 15 acres of riverland in the postscript, and the additional acreage the court's surveyor had included because no adjoining property had claimed it. 43 acres of fertile ground and water in the desert of the Arizona Territory. She walked out onto the porch with the paper in her hand. Josephine was in the small garden she had begun to tend against the western wall of the canyon, watering with a tin cup a row of hollyhock seedlings Prudence had brought her from Dry Fork. Winifred said her name once. The child looked up. Winifred held out the paper. Josephine looked at the paper. She looked at her mother. She looked at the paper again. "Is it ours, Mommy?" "It is ours." The child dropped the tin cup. She ran the length of the walkway. Winifred caught her against her hip and held her for a long moment in the winter sunlight on the flagstone of the porch. Her husband had laid with such patience across some Saturday she would never be able to picture, but which she now forever would carry as if she had watched him lay each stone. The letter to Nathaniel Ashford at the Colorado School of Mines went out in the following week. It included Silas Redfern's written notes and a formal copy of the newly issued title of possession. Ashford's reply came in March. He proposed a visit in April at his own expense to conduct a preliminary geological survey. He came with 2 assistants and a light spring wagon of instruments, and he stayed 5 days. He climbed the northern wall in the mornings and drilled small core samples in the afternoons, and spent his evenings at the mesquite table making notations in a black cloth notebook with a mechanical pencil that pleased Josephine because it clicked when he pressed its cap. On the evening of the 5th day, with the samples packed and the horses ready for the departure at dawn, Ashford accepted a second cup of coffee. He set the mug down. He said, "Mrs. Ashcombe, I cannot tell you this is a silver mine. I can tell you it is a formation that merits serious investment and exploration. If that exploration confirms what the surface samples suggest, you are sitting on a piece of ground that is going to change the economic situation of your family significantly." She looked at him across the table for the length of a slow breath. "How significantly?" "The preliminary estimate based on the surface samples only places the potential value of the deposit somewhere between $40,000 and $120,000, depending on the depth and continuity of the veins." Marbury rode up from Tucson for the negotiation. It was the first time the lawyer had set foot on the ground he had defended on paper, and he arrived on the mail wagon with a single carpet bag and the mild curiosity of a professional who had wanted for many months to see the thing he had been arguing about. He met Ashford in the front room. The negotiation lasted 2 hours. The final agreement placed the exploration costs on the mining company Ashford represented. If exploration confirmed the surface findings, Winifred would receive 17% of production royalties, would retain full title to the land, and would hold the right to terminate the contract if production had not commenced within 5 years. It was not the maximum agreement possible in absolute terms. It was solid. It was legal. It placed the control in her hands and not in the company's. Marbury reviewed the final draft in his careful hand and pronounced it in his slow, professional way, a good agreement. She signed it. The seasons after the signing turned as seasons had always turned in the canyon. She planted the 2 acres of the river bottom that spring with corn from seed Prudence had saved. She hired 2 men out of Copper Hollow at $6 a month with room and board, one of whom knew planting and one of whom said he could learn. She struck a small arrangement with Barnaby Quill for the use of the river water for his goats during the dry months in exchange for 4 wheels of cheese a month. She built in the second summer an additional room off the north wing of the house. 2 rooms, in fact, once she had measured properly and understood there was space for them, and Prudence Whitlock moved into those rooms permanently when her son's wife bore their first child at Dry Fork, and the ranch there became too small for all of them. Prudence brought her mule and her seeds, and the old goat Betsy, whom Josephine still called by name every morning at the milking pail, and she brought a wicker chair that had belonged to her own mother, and that was the one object in the world she treated with anything resembling reverence. Josephine grew inside the canyon walls the way a plant grows inside a greenhouse. She learned the medicinal herbs from Winifred. She learned the goats and the reading of the wind from Prudence. She learned the geological terms from Nathaniel Ashford, who returned twice a year through the exploration phase, and who developed a habit on those visits of explaining rock formations to the child with the same seriousness he would have used with a graduate student, so that by the age of 10, Josephine could correctly identify quartz, porphyry, granite, basalt, and shale, and could sketch on a piece of butcher paper the strike and dip of a mineral vein. She learned to read from her mother first with the McGuffey primer that Winifred had carried her whole life, and then with the Bible, and then with the reports of the mining engineer, which she requested to be allowed to study on her own after Winifred and Marbury had finished with them. At 12, she could explain the geology of the canyon to visiting government agents with a precision that left the men slightly stunned. At 15, she conducted the first correspondence in her own hand with Marbury's office on questions arising from the royalty contract under her mother's oversight, but with a vocabulary of law and mineralogy she had absorbed on her own through the long hours of the desert afternoons. The mine began production in the autumn of 1893. The first royalty payment, a bank draft drawn on the Bank of Arizona Territory in the amount of $432, arrived at the canyon by mail in December of that year. Winifred read the draft. She read it again. She carried it into the small white room where the chest had grown fuller with each passing season, and she placed the draft on top of the 38-page letter, and she closed the lid of the chest, and she went back out onto the porch, and she made coffee, and she did not tell Josephine about the money that evening, because a moment like that belonged first to the man who had made it possible, and she wanted the quiet to sit with him a little while before the world took its share. Copper Hollow acquired a new municipal president in the second summer after the judgment, a young lawyer of 34 named Lucius Palmer, who had studied at the University of Michigan and returned west because his wife's health required the dry air. Palmer had the habit unusual for a man in his position of visiting the ranches and holdings of the county in person to understand the actual condition of their inhabitants. He rode into the canyon on a Tuesday afternoon in September with his secretary and without prior notice. He walked the ground for 2 hours. I saw the well, the water channel, the plots, the garden, the river at the south, the new fenced pasture along the river where the 2 hired men were breaking a plow team. He spoke with Prudence, who was hanging bunches of drying yarrow from the north eaves of the house. He sat at the mesquite table at the end of the 2 hours and accepted a cup of coffee. He said, "Mrs. Ashcombe, there is something the town is considering, and I wanted to consult you before we act." "Tell me." "The town council is discussing the possibility of building an official road connecting Copper Hollow with the region south of your canyon. It is territory that has not been on any municipal map because no one has worked it. But if you are producing there, and if there is a mine and exploration, the town has an interest in connecting the region with the main road system. It would be good for the town. It would be good for you." She thought for a moment. What would the town need from me? A letter of no objection to the road along the boundary of your property. And if the road is built, a commitment that the adjoining parcels to the south, which are lands without declared owner, may be considered for distribution to families willing to settle the region. She sat with that for a while. She thought of the families that would come. She thought of the sound of a country that filled with voices. She thought of what Thaddeus would have said. Thaddeus, who had walked that ground for 4 years, convinced it held value that no one else could see. "I have one condition. Tell me that among the families who settle to the south, single women, widows, mothers without husbands be included on equal terms with the men." the same access, the same support, the same papers. Palmer looked at her. He looked at his secretary. He looked back at her. That is unusual. I know. A silence. It is not impossible. Then we have something to discuss. The road took 2 years to build. Municipal things always took twice as long as their announcements. When it reached the mouth of the canyon in the autumn of 1895, it brought, as roads always bring, what roads bring. People. 3 families the first year, 5 the second. One of the families of the second year was headed by a widow of 42 named Amaryllis Trueheart, whose husband had been a miner at Bisbee and who arrived with 3 adolescent sons and a quiet, grave determination that Winifred recognized at once as her own kind. Amaryllis took the parcel south of the river. She planted her first corn in the same autumn of her arrival. Word from Copper Hollow reached the canyon by the same trail Prudence had once ridden alone. Cornelius Ashcombe had sold the house on Mesquite Street in the 2nd August after Thaddeus's death for $110, $30 less than the price he and Winifred had paid for it in 1885 to cover debts from a cattle season that had gone badly. Cornelius and Hester moved to a rented house on Camino Street, which was, Winifred remembered with a perfect equanimity, precisely where Cornelius had told her to go when he had put her out of her own home with $43. Hester kept house there without the servants she had enjoyed on Mesquite Street. Millicent, who had been 2 years old at the wedding in the stone church at Prescott and was now 17, took a position as a school teacher's assistant in Copper Hollow that same year and paid a portion of the rent to her mother out of her small monthly wage, a thing Prudence remarked upon with quiet approval when the news reached Dry Fork. Winifred did not feel satisfaction at the account of any of it. She felt, if anything, a soft sadness for Thaddeus, who had wanted a different kind of brother, who had wanted a brother who did not need to become the man he had become in the days after the funeral. Thaddeus had not had that brother. He had had Cornelius, and he had done what he could with what he had, which was more than any of them had known. Ambrose Ashcombe came to the canyon alone in the summer of 1895. He was 22 years old. He rode in on a good horse and dismounted at the Mesquite Gate and walked the last stretch on foot with his hat in his hand, and the woman who watched him come was no longer the woman he had seen in the corridor of the land office. She had begun to gray at her temples. She had begun to hold her shoulders in the manner of a woman who owned her own ground and did not have to explain that ownership to anyone. She met him at the porch. He did not sit. He said, "Aunt Winifred, I have come to ask if there is work here. I have left my father's business. He does not know I am here." She studied him for a long moment, the Ashcombe jaw, the eyes that measured, but the shoulders had shifted since Tucson, and the eyes did not measure the way they had measured in the corridor. She said, "There is work here. There is always work here. But if you come to work in this canyon, you come as a hand, not as family. Do you understand?" "I understand. You take orders from Prudence and from the men. You do not speak to my daughter unless she speaks first. You earn your pay week by week." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to the porch railing and let a long breath go into the canyon air. Then she said, "Put your horse in the corral. Prudence will show you the bunkhouse. Supper is at 6. He worked that summer and the autumn and the winter and the following spring. He learned. He kept his hat in his hand. In the second year, he began to speak with Josephine at supper about the mineral samples she was cataloging for Ashford's next visit. And Josephine, who had been 12 when he arrived and was now 14, met his interest with the cool, measured attention of a young woman who had been raised to expect that her intelligence would be treated as an ordinary fact. Winifred watched this from the head of the table without commentary. Whatever Ambrose became in the years that followed, and he did in fact become something other than his father, he became it in the canyon. Temperance Hollis, whom Winifred had not seen since the morning she had walked out of the house on Mesquite Street, with the canvas satchel over her shoulder, came to the canyon in the spring of 1896. She was 62 now, and her back had begun to trouble her and her cousin, who had taken her in when the taxes on her own small house had grown too heavy, had died the previous winter. Winifred met her at the Mesquite Gate and did not say anything for a long moment because there were no words for what needed to be said between them, and Temperance did not need any. Winifred took the old woman's carpetbag from her hand and led her through the gate and along the flagstone walk and into the second of the 2 rooms she had built for Prudence, which had been empty since its completion, waiting though Winifred had not known for whom. Temperance lived in that room for the rest of her days. She taught Josephine the small kitchen songs that had come down her mother's line from Ohio, and she sat in the sun each afternoon watching the plots, and she died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of '98 and was buried in the small graveyard at the south end of the river property, near the grave of a middle son of Amaryllis Trueheart, who had been lost to fever in the third year of the settlement. Bridget Halloran, in her small house outside Prescott, lived long enough to hold the first bank draft in her worn hands. Winifred had ridden the 2 days north with the draft folded in the pocket of her coat in the spring after it arrived, and had placed it on her mother's kitchen table without ceremony, and Bridget had studied it through the reading spectacles she had begun to wear only in her 70th year, and had said the sentence Winifred would keep with her the rest of her life. "You have made your husband's word into ground. There is nothing better a woman can do with a promise." Bridget died 2 winters later in the January of '93 in her sleep in the room she had shared with Eamon for 41 years. She was buried next to him in the small cemetery outside Prescott. Winifred rode north for the burial with Josephine beside her on the second mare, and the two of them stood at the graveside in the cold, clear light, and Winifred understood standing there that she had become the woman her mother had raised her to become, and that her mother had lived long enough to see it, which was in the accounting of any life a great deal. By the year 1899, the ground that Reuben Blackwood had wanted, and that Thaddeus Ashcombe had built for, and that Cornelius Ashcombe had dismissed as Scorpion Gulch had become a place. The mine was in its 6th year of production. The royalty had grown from the first $432 to sums. Winifred no longer counted with her fingers. The plots produced chili and squash and beans and enough tomato to sell into the Copper Hollow market. The river bottom had 18 acres in corn and alfalfa. 2 dozen goats grazed the upper slopes under the care of a young man Barnaby Quill had trained before his own death in the winter of '97, a peaceful death in the same 3-room ranch to which he had welcomed a strange woman and a small child 8 years earlier. Prudence Whitlock, 78, now still tended her garden. She moved a little slower. She still had her mother's wicker chair, which now sat in the room that had been added to the north wing for her, and which she still treated with the reverence a person gives to the one physical object that has followed her across the whole of her life. Josephine Ashcombe turned 16 that summer. She had grown tall like her father and had her mother's careful hands, and she had begun to spend her mornings in correspondence with a professor of geology at the university in Tucson, who had first written to her after Ashford had mentioned her name at a mining conference in Denver. Winifred did not open those letters. She left them on the mesquite table for Josephine to find when she came in from the plots. She had raised, she understood by then, a woman who would not need her mother to answer her correspondence for her. It was one of the private small satisfactions of the years. She sat on the porch on the last night of 1899 with a cup of coffee and Prudence in the wicker chair beside her, and Josephine asleep in the room that had been Josephine's since she had been 6 years old. The sky above the canyon corridor was very clear. The stars did what stars did over the desert in December, which was to press downward with an intimate weight. From the direction of the mine drift, half a mile up the north wall, came the faint, intermittent sound of the night crew's hammer on rock. From the river bottom to the south came nothing, because the corn was in and the field was resting. The stone channel, which had run for a decade without interruption, and would run for a decade more, made its small, constant thread of sound at the edge of the flagstones. Prudence said, "Do you think of him still?" Winifred did not answer at once. "Every day. Not the way I used to. Not with the whole. Something more like a conversation that has never stopped. That is a good way. It is the way that came." She looked down at the coffee. She looked back up at the strip of stars. "I speak to him about the ground. I speak to him about Josephine. I speak to him about the ones who arrive at the road, about the widows. When Amaryllis Trueheart lost her middle son to fever in the 3rd year, I spoke to Thaddeus about that for a long time. He is a good listener, even now. He always was. He was." Prudence set down her cup. She said in the tone she used only for the sentences she meant to leave unanswered, "You did what he asked, and more than he asked." Winifred smiled at the corridor of stars. She said, "The country did most of it. I only stayed. That is one way to name it, not the true one." Prudence rose slowly, tucked the wicker chair with the small ceremony that had become her nightly ritual, and went into the house. Winifred sat alone for a little while longer. She thought of the 7 words she had carried against her breast the length of 2 days in the desert. She thought of the 38 pages folded in the chest. She thought of the marks she had cut into the porphyry beside her husband's cross, her horizontal line across his cruciform, a signature of a partnership that had continued past the boundary the world had set for it. She thought about the widow Amaryllis Trueheart, whose middle son had been buried in the small graveyard she had permitted at the far south end of the river property alongside Temperance now. She thought about Barnaby Quill, who had died with his hand around the hand of the young herder he had trained. She thought about her mother in the small cemetery outside Prescott, who had lived long enough to hold the draft. She thought about the coldness of the kiss Cornelius had given her at the altar in Prescott 20 years earlier, and about how a woman learns if she is careful to file away the small signals of the world and to use them later. And she thought without bitterness now, without heat, about her brother-in-law, who had walked into her parlor on the day of a burial and had spoken the words that had set the entire arc of her life in motion. If Cornelius had not put her out with $43, she might have stayed on Mesquite Street. She might have taken the pension, whatever pension the law allowed a widow, and she might have raised Josephine in the small rooms of that rented town, and the canyon and the mine and the road, and the widow Trueheart, and every other consequence would have belonged to another life. Cornelius had given her without meaning to, without ever understanding it, the push toward the shape her husband had drawn. She stood at last from the porch. The coffee was cold. The canyon walls held their old warmth from the day and would release it slowly through the small hours until dawn. She looked out at the strip of sky between the walls, that corridor of black and light, and she said aloud in a voice pitched so quietly that only the stones and the water and the memory of the man she had married could hear her. "The debt is paid, Thaddeus. The house you built is standing. Our daughter reads better than either of us. The country does not scare her. It never will." On the porch of the house her husband had raised brick by brick in the chair. No one now remembered exactly who had first placed there. Winifred Halloran Ashcombe finished her coffee. She looked at the sky over the canyon that had, at that hour of the evening, the deep clear blue of the territory, a color that seemed a second horizon aimed upward. She felt, without needing to name it exactly, and without needing to name it, what a person feels when the life she had, and the life she lost, and the life she built with her own hands, come to rest inside the same space without contradiction. When the loss and the gratitude and the love and the ground that is yours, truly yours, fit inside the same chest. Only a single warm and complete weight remained, which, if it had to be called by any name, was called hope. Hope from within. The kind that does not come from outside, that no one needs to grant, because it has been there all along, waiting like water that comes from so deep, no drought can touch where it begins.